Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Claire, and this is Iris. So our Capstone project, it's about the motives and risks of multinational pharmaceutical companies bribing in China. So today we're going to follow the following agenda and talking about why we choose this topic, how we did our research, and what we have found out. Medical corruption has been one of the most severe worldwide corruption phenomenon. In 2013, GSK, the largest drug producer in UK, was accused of medical corruption in China, and it was fined 3 billion RMB. Well, at that time, this scandal has aroused heated discussion and global concerns. But actually, it's not just a single event, and it has triggered a series of exposures of the foreign medical companies' bribery scandals in China. And we have now the reasons to believe that China has become one of the high incidence areas of foreign medical companies' bribery. So, what is medical bribery? Now I'm going to show you one of the most simplified situations. So here, this is the drug producer or the sales representative. And the approach to the doctor saying that, sell our medicine and then I will pay you a significant commission. And from the point of view of the doctor, the more expensive medicine I prescribe for my patients, the more commission I could earn. And this behavior has artificially raised up the medicine price in China. So according to a related study, in China, on average, when you buy a medicine, 20% of the cost is 20% of the price is the ex-factory cost, and 30% of the price is the circulation cost, and then the rest 50% is the so-called public relationship cost, which we all know is actually the bribery cost. Because the drug producer, they have to conduct bribery on every single cycle of the distribution channel. And the only way they could earn back this money is to increase the medicine price. So eventually, who is going to pay for this? That's the patient. That could be you, that could be me, that could be our families, that could be any innocent people who simply go to the hospital. Well, you may say that corruption is never a news in China, right? I agree with you. I agree with you that corruption and bribery is in every aspect, every layers in the Chinese society. The Panama Papers, right? But medical corruption is different. Why do I say so? Because I believe to live and to live healthily, that is the fundamental right of every human being. And this right now is being violated. There are people dying. There are people suffering from disease simply because they cannot afford the high price, which is artificially raised up by their illegal behavior. So medical corruption is not just about money, it's about life. And this is why we want to look into this issue. And this is why we want to find out why those foreign medical companies, they choose China to conduct bribery and what kind of risks that they might have been faced with. Now I'll pass to Iris.
Thank you, Claire. Considering this, it's worth us to think about what on earth triggered those multinational companies to bribe in China. And we have identified two motives. One is the legislative factors. The imperfect legal system in China has resulted in the faint legal consciousness and the authorities lack regulations. The Chinese anti-unfair competition law has a blurred definition of bribery, and also it has been criticized for its slight punishment for years. As in 2013, GSK was fined 3 billion RMB, amounting less than 0.1% of its annual profit. However, in 2012, the US authorities charged GSK $3 billion, which amounts up to 1/4 of its annual profits. And the other motive is the institutional factors, after comparing the healthcare systems of China, United States, and Hong Kong, we have identified certain institutional loopholes. And these venal merchants have maliciously and intentionally taken advantage of these institutional loopholes to generate overwhelming profits. First of all, the Chinese hospitals relied heavily on the drug selling, while the US has clear division of medical treatment and drug sales. The concept to generate profits from drug selling starts from the first Chinese medical reform in 1985, when hospitals were allowed to charge 50% markup to the retail price, and this strategy has helped the public hospitals to survive the post-war economic recession. Whereas in the United States, there are clear distinction of duties between the doctors and the pharmacists since the 18th century. And when the doctors have the responsibility to diagnose and conduct the therapy, they have no right to dispense prescriptions, which is the main duty of the pharmacist. And moreover, the US hospitals do not have outpatient pharmacies, but only the inpatient ones. In US, the drug sales only occupies 5% of its total income. By contrast, the drug selling contributes 2/5 of the total Chinese hospitals' revenue. The second factor revolves around the doctor's incentives. Doctor has been regarded as a noble occupation for thousands of years. However, doctors in China, they struggled, they suffered, and they were disrespected as they have to go through all this heavy workload while bearing huge risk. And they were even threatened by these personal attacks from time to time. What's more, all these miseries were not compensated with the tantamount salaries. Oppositely, the doctors in Hong Kong, they received decent salary payments as they believe that this strategy can encourage probity. As you can see here, the doctors in China, they receive a payment of $11,000 per year, which exceeds the average level slightly. However, if you look at here, the Hong Kong doctor's salary amounts up to 3 to 4 times of an ordinary worker. And the government has 100% responsible for these salary payments. So the healthcare expenditure in Hong Kong occupies 5% of its total GDP, while in contrast, that only accounts for 1% of the Chinese whole GDP, not to mention the large population of Chinese citizens. Last but not least, is how easily can a patient gain access to the medical service. The public hospitals in China have dominated the medical resources, so the citizens have few choices but to go to the public hospitals for better service, and this has strengthened the hospital's bargaining power. On the contrary, the Hong Kong healthcare systems runs on dual track basis by encompassing both the public and private sectors. The inpatient accounts for 85% of the total public hospitals patients, but those in the private clinics only accounts for 15%. And this suggests a clear separate of market positioning between the public and private hospitals. And these dual-track systems enables the patient to choose freely. Coming up, Claire will talk about how risky it is for the MNCs to bribe in China.
Okay, thank you, Iris. So talking about the risks, please imagine you are doing something illegal and you are happily counting your dirty money. And what's the first thing that you're concerned about? And the first thing jumping to my mind is that the police, they might be watching. And this means criminal punishment. And for most of cases of medical bribery, the punishment is in the form of penalty. So here we summarize the penalties in the last 5 years for the multinational pharmaceutical companies' bribery in China. So here we can see the penalty, most of them is under $50 million US. But if you compare with their annual sales, especially for the large medical companies, their sales reach over 20 billion US dollars. So the penalty is actually negligible. Even if we look into an extreme case, which is GSK, and it was fined 490 million, which is the highest in the last 5 years, it still only contributes to around 1% of its global sales. So we think that the direct economic loss from the penalty is not a major risk. Okay, so let's go back to our story. What else? Who else might be watching? The media, the journalists. And once the bribery scandal is exposed by the media, the company is going to suffer from the damaged reputation, the drop of stock price, and finally, the shrink of the market value. So here, we selected 10 medical companies with the largest market capitalization in the world. Their market cap range from around 50 billion US dollars to the top is Roche, over 200 billion US dollars. They are huge companies. And when the giants, when their bribery scandals are exposed by the media, they also suffer from a stock price drop. And if we take the market value into consideration, here we can see that the average market value loss is 1.8 billion US dollar. So when you compare this number with the penalty, this is in a totally different magnitude. So compared with penalty, we think the shrink of market value is a more significant risk. But this is not the end. Okay, we come back to the story again. So when you conduct business in China, there is always one thing you can never ignore: the big background. That is the Chinese government. So if the government is particularly strict with the foreign companies in terms of medical corruption, it will be a very dangerous signal for them. So regarding the Chinese government's attitude, here are the questions we want to ask. Does the government treat the foreign and domestic companies equally? Is there any bias? Is there any predetermined tendencies when they deal with the medical bribery cases of the foreign companies? So we conducted an event study to answer these questions on the post-incidence effects of the stock prices. And the events are actually the bribery scandals. And here we have 15 bribery scandals in China conducted by the foreign companies and 3 conducted by the domestic companies. And among all these scandals, there are mainly 4 types: anonymous report, media exposure, police investigation, and criminal punishment. So from the top to the bottom, the degree of the government involvement gradually increases. So we try to observe that when each of the bribery scandal broke out, what is the stock reaction on the 3 groups of company? First group, the corrupt companies themselves. Second group, the domestic medical companies, which is representative by a stock index which consists of 100 domestic medical firms. And the stock reaction of the other foreign medical companies who also conduct business in China. So our hypothesis here, we assume that if the market is free from external manipulation, if the market treats the foreign and domestic companies equally, then this should be the pattern. So first of all, the corrupt companies, their own stock price should drop. This is easy to understand because their reputation is damaged. And for the domestic or the foreign company, no matter where they come from, as long as they are in the same market, they should all be negatively influenced because the scandals tend to affect the investors' confidence and outlook of the entire industry. So let's see the results. Are they consistent with our hypothesis? So firstly, we look into the 15 bribery cases by the foreign medical companies. The corrupt companies themselves, the price drop, good, consistent with our hypothesis. But the interesting thing and the abnormal thing is that the domestic index, their stock price increased 12 out of 15%. That's the majority. Okay, we'll discuss that later. And for the foreign companies, we actually cannot find a specific pattern. And this is actually easy to understand because they are actually global companies and the revenue come from the Chinese market is only a minor part of their global sales. And then to compare, we look into the situation when domestic medical companies bribe. And here, the corrupt companies' own stock price dropped significantly, and the domestic medical companies, they also dropped, and the foreign companies increased. It might be a little bit confusing, but I will summarize the interesting facts for you. The interesting thing is that when domestic company scandals broke out, the domestic index decreased. But when the foreign company scandal broke out in China, the domestic index actually increased. So what are the implications? So firstly, we think that the foreign and domestic companies, they are not treated equally in terms of the medical corruption. And secondly, the government may have taken some actions to protect the domestic firms from being impacted by the foreign companies' bribery scandals. Or there's another possibility that the government may encourage the media to expose the foreign companies' bribery cases because they also observe the pattern we observed that the domestic market positively react on the foreign companies' bribery scandals. But in both of the scenarios, we can say that the Chinese government has a preference of domestic companies over foreign companies. And it is not likely for the foreign companies to find any shelter from the government. So when we take all the factors into consideration, we can conclude that this is the most material risk for the MNCs. Now I'll pass to Iris.
Thank you. Thank you, Claire. So now we come to the final part of this presentation, which is the limitations and outlooks. So we have identified two limitations. First one is the limited resources of information. Since the government will be involved in this research, some information can be sealed and remain confidential to us. And the other is the various factors that were unable to be eliminated, and these factors may also contribute to the stock price change. And to look into the future, we have intended to study the follow-up actions of the Chinese healthcare reform mentioned in the 13th five-year plan starting from this year to see whether it can indeed make any difference. That's the end of our presentation. Thanks for listening.
Thank you.